lonely preacher saved a dying outlaw, only to discover he was his son from years ago. A dying outlaw collapsed at a preacher's door with 3 bullets in his chest. But the man who saved his life had no idea he was staring into his own son's eyes. The sun hung low over the desert chapel like a dying coal, casting long shadows across the weathered wooden cross that marked Reverend Samuel Cross's lonely sanctuary. For 12 years, he had called this place home, a simple building of sun-bleached boards and cracked adobe, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and silence. The nearest town lay 20 miles south, and most days, Samuel preferred it that way. He was sweeping dust from the chapel steps when he heard the horse stumble. The sound came from beyond a ridge, hoofbeats irregular and desperate, followed by a crash that sent birds scattering from the mesquite. Samuel dropped his broom and hurried toward the sound, his black coat billowing in the evening wind. What he found made him stop cold. A man lay crumpled beside an overturned horse, blood pooling dark in the sand beneath him. His shirt was torn open, revealing 3 ragged bullet holes across his chest. The horse, a magnificent bay stallion, struggled to rise, favoring its left foreleg. The saddle bore no brand, but the silver conchos caught the last light like fallen stars. The stranger was young, maybe 25, with dark hair matted against his skull and a beard that couldn't hide the sharp angles of his face. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a fight against the encroaching dark. Blood frothed at the corner of his mouth. Samuel knelt beside him, pressing his hand against the worst of the wounds. The man's eyes fluttered open, gray eyes, like storm clouds over the prairie. They fixed on Samuel's face with surprising clarity. "Don't," the stranger whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Don't waste your time." "Hush now," Samuel said, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You're hurt, but you're not done yet." The man tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that painted his lips with blood. 3 bullets say different. Samuel looked toward his chapel, measuring the distance. 50 yards across sand and stone. The stranger was solid-muscled despite his youth, and dead weight besides. But something in those gray eyes, a flicker of desperate hope beneath the resignation, decided him. "I'm going to lift you," Samuel said. "It's going to hurt. Already hurts." Samuel slipped his arms beneath the man's shoulders and knees, grunting as he rose. The stranger was heavier than expected, and warm blood soaked through Samuel's shirt as he carried him toward the chapel. Each step was a prayer, each stumble a small betrayal of the trust placed in his arms. The stranger's head lolled against Samuel's shoulder, and he mumbled something that sounded like Mary. The name hit Samuel like a physical blow, but he forced himself to keep walking. Inside the chapel, Samuel laid the man on the wooden pew closest to the altar. Lamplight danced across the stranger's face, revealing features that seemed almost familiar in the shifting shadows. Samuel pushed the thought away. Pain and desperation could make any face look like home. He worked quickly, fetching water and clean cloth from the vestry. The bullets had passed clean through, which meant less chance of infection, but more immediate blood loss. Samuel packed the wounds with torn strips of his spare shirt, his hands steady despite the terrible intimacy of the moment. "What's your name?" Samuel asked as he worked. The stranger's eyes had closed, but they opened again at the question. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with the answer. "Tom," he said finally. "Tom." "Brennan." The surname meant nothing to Samuel, but something about the way the man said Tom made his chest tighten. He focused on the bandages, winding them tight around the stranger's torso. "What happened to you, Tom?" "Bossy." The word came out like a curse. "Caught up to me. Outside redemption. Should have stayed in Mexico." Samuel's hands paused. "What did you do?" Tom's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "What didn't I do? Banks, stages, cattle, took what I wanted when I wanted it." His gray eyes found Samuel's face. "You afraid of me now, preacher?" Samuel resumed his bandaging. "Should I be? Most folks are. I'm not most folks." Tom studied him in the lamplight, something like curiosity flickering in his fevered gaze. "No," he said slowly. "I don't suppose you are." Samuel finished with the bandages and sat back on his heels. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. Tom needed more help than Samuel could provide. A doctor, real medicine, time to heal. But the nearest physician was in Redemption, and if what Tom said was true, that town would be no sanctuary. "Why did you come here?" Samuel asked. Tom closed his eyes. Horse picked the direction. Just wanted to get away from the guns. He was quiet for so long that Samuel thought he'd fallen unconscious. Then, "You ever run from something, preacher?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Samuel thought of Mary's tears, of a child's small hand reaching for him as he walked away, of 23 years spent trying to forget the sound of his own name being called down an empty street. "Yes," he said quietly. "Ever catch up to you?" Samuel looked at Tom's face in the lamplight. Young, hard-used, marked by choices that couldn't be undone. Something stirred in his memory, a ghost of recognition he couldn't quite grasp. "I don't know," he answered truthfully. "Maybe it has." Tom's breathing was growing more labored, his skin pale as morning clouds. Samuel rose and moved to the small altar, where he kept his few medical supplies. As he gathered laudanum and fresh bandages, he heard Tom whisper something that made his blood freeze. "Tell Mary, tell her I tried to come home." Samuel's hand stilled. Mary. The name that had haunted his dreams for 23 years. The name of the woman he'd loved and abandoned, who'd carried his child and raised him alone while Samuel ran toward the safety of God and away from the weight of being a father. He turned back to Tom, studying his face with new eyes. The shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the stubborn set of his mouth, even in unconsciousness, all of it suddenly, impossibly familiar. Samuel sank to his knees beside the pew, his heart hammering against his ribs. It couldn't be. The child he'd walked away from would be 23 now, close to Tom's age. But that child had been named Thomas, not Tom, and his mother's last name had been Brennan, Samuel whispered. Mary's maiden name. The name she would have given their son after Samuel disappeared into the desert to find his God and lose his shame. Tom's eyes opened, fixing on Samuel's face with frightening intensity. "You look like you've seen a ghost, preacher." Samuel couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The lamplight seemed to dim, and the weight of 23 years settled on his shoulders like stones. This broken outlaw bleeding on his chapel floor. This was the child he'd abandoned. The son he'd never known. The boy who'd grown up hearing his father's name whispered like a prayer by a woman who'd loved coward. And now that child lay, dying, shaped by the very absence Samuel had created. In the flickering shadows of the chapel, Samuel Cross stared into eyes that mirrored his own, and wondered if some sins were too great for even God to forgive, or if recognition had come 23 years too late to matter. The dying outlaw whispered his mother's name in his fever dreams, and the preacher realized he was listening to his own son confess 23 years of abandonment. The night stretched endless as the desert itself. Samuel sat beside the pew where Tom lay fighting for each breath, a damp cloth in one hand and a cup of water in the other. The lamp on the altar cast dancing shadows across the chapel walls, making the rough-hewn cross above them seem to sway like a tree in a storm. Tom's fever had worsened as the hours passed. His skin burned to the touch, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the desert's cool night air. Samuel dabbed at it with gentle strokes, the same way he'd once cooled Mary's fever during that terrible winter when he stopped himself. There was no point in remembering what he'd destroyed with his own cowardice. "Water," Tom mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Samuel lifted Tom's head and pressed the cup to his lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but some made it past the cracked lips. Tom swallowed once, twice, then his head fell back against the makeshift pillows Samuel had fashioned from hymnals wrapped in cloth. "That's good," Samuel said softly. "Rest now." But Tom couldn't rest. The fever had him in its grip, dragging him through landscapes of memory that spilled out in broken words and half-formed confessions. Samuel listened because he had no choice, and with each whispered phrase, the weight in his chest grew heavier. She used to sing. Tom murmured, his eyes moving beneath closed lids. Sundays after church. Irish songs made me feel safe. Samuel's hand stilled on Tom's forehead. Mary had been born in Boston to Irish parents. Her voice had been clear as spring water, especially when she sang the old songs her grandmother had taught her. What was her name? Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer would break him. Mary. Tom's head turned towards Samuel's voice. Mary Brennan. Most beautiful woman in Colorado Territory. Hair like autumn leaves. His breathing hitched. She loved a man once. Before me. He left her with nothing but promises. The words hit Samuel like physical blows. He closed his eyes and saw Mary as she'd been at 19. Red gold hair catching sunlight, green eyes full of trust and hope. He'd promised her everything and delivered nothing but a child she'd have to raise alone. Tell me about him, Samuel heard himself say. Tom's laugh was bitter, broken by coughing that brought fresh blood to his lips. What's to tell? Coward. Ran when things got hard. Left her to face the whispers, the shame. Left me to grow up hearing his name like a curse. What was his name? The question hung in the air between them. Tom's eyes opened, unfocused and bright with fever. But for a moment, they seemed to look right through Samuel to something beyond. Samuel, he whispered. Samuel Cross. She kept his name, carved it into her heart like a brand. Told me he was called to serve God. Tom's mouth twisted. Guess God was more important than his family. Samuel's vision blurred. The lamplight seemed to dim, and the chapel walls pressed in around him like the sides of a grave. 23 years of sermons about forgiveness, about redemption, about God's infinite mercy. And here lay the proof of his own damnation, dying because of choices that started with Samuel's abandonment. She never married. Tom continued, his voice growing weaker, said she was already married in her heart. Waited for him to come back, until the day she died. His hand fumbled for something that wasn't there. Consumption took her 5 years ago. Called his name at the end. The cloth fell from Samuel's numb fingers. Mary was dead. The woman he'd loved and betrayed and spent 23 years trying to forget had died calling his name. And this broken outlaw, this son he'd never known, had watched it happen. I'm sorry, Samuel whispered, though the words felt like dust in his mouth. Tom's fevered gaze fixed on him with surprising clarity. Why? You didn't know her, but I did, Samuel thought. I loved her more than my own soul, and I destroyed her anyway. Tell me about yourself, Samuel said instead. Your life, what led you here? Tom was quiet for so long that Samuel thought he'd drifted back into unconsciousness. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of every year Samuel had missed. Started young. 12, maybe 13, caught stealing bread from the general store. Sheriff wanted to make an example. Tom's hand moved to his ribs, touching scars that predated tonight's wounds. 20 lashes. Mary begged him to stop, but he shrugged, the gesture small and heartbreaking. Guess that's when I learned the law wasn't for folks like us. Samuel remembered the boy he'd abandoned, small for his age, with serious eyes and a stubborn chin. That child had become this broken man, shaped by poverty and violence and the absence of a father who might have stood between him and the world's cruelty. First time I robbed a stage, I was 16, Tom continued. Told myself it was for Mary, to get her medicine, food, a better place to live. But after she died, his voice trailed off. After that, it was just what I was. What he made me. He, the absent father. The ghost that had haunted both their lives. The posse that shot you, Samuel said carefully. What happened? Tom's laugh was hollow. Bank in redemption. Went wrong from the start. Guard recognized me from a wanted poster, started shooting before I even drew my gun. Got away, but he touched the bandages over his chest. Barely. How much? What? How much did you take? Tom studied Samuel's face in the lamplight. Why? You thinking about turning me in for the reward? No. Samuel said quietly. "I just want to understand. $300. Tom closed his eyes. Enough to buy a headstone for Mary's grave. She's buried in pauper's ground. No marker, no name. Thought maybe—" His voice broke. "Thought maybe I could give her that much. Make up for all the times I couldn't protect her." The weight of it settled on Samuel like stones. This outlaw, his son, had risked his life for $300 to buy dignity for the woman Samuel had failed. The woman who died poor and forgotten while Samuel lived in his desert sanctuary, serving a God who'd never asked him to abandon his family. She would have been proud, Samuel said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. Tom's eyes opened again, searching Samuel's face. "You think so? I know so." They sat in silence as the night deepened around them. The lamp burned lower, casting longer shadows, and Tom's breathing grew more labored. Samuel could see death approaching in the gray pallor of his skin, the way his chest struggled to rise and fall. "Preacher," Tom said suddenly. "Yes. If you ever meet a man named Samuel Cross." Tom's hand found Samuel's wrist, gripping it with surprising strength. Tell him his son tried to be better. Tell him Mary never stopped loving him, but she deserved more than his memory." Samuel's throat closed. He looked down at the hand gripping his wrist, the same long fingers he remembered tracing Mary's face in the lamplight 23 years ago. The same stubborn strength. "I'll tell him," Samuel whispered. Tom nodded and closed his eyes. His grip loosened, and his hand fell back to his chest. For a moment, Samuel thought he'd lost him, but then Tom's lips moved in what might have been a prayer or might have been Mary's name. The lamp flickered, throwing wild shadows across the chapel walls, and Samuel sat vigil over the son he'd never known, wondering if confession could bridge 23 years of silence, or if some truths were too heavy for dying men to carry. As dawn crept toward the horizon, Samuel Cross faced the weight of recognition, knowing that the next words he spoke might be the most important and most damaging of his life. The preacher stared at the dying outlaw and whispered the word that would change everything. Thomas. It was his son's real name, and 23 years of abandonment hung in the silence that followed. Dawn came like a judgment, painting the desert sky in shades of blood and gold. Samuel had not moved from his place beside the pew, had not slept, had barely breathed. He watched the light creep through the chapel's single window and fall across Tom's face, revealing details that memory had been too merciful to show him in the lamplight. There, beneath the beard and the hard-earned scars, was the child he'd walked away from. The same stubborn jaw Samuel saw in his shaving mirror each morning. The same dark lashes that had once fluttered against chubby cheeks when Mary sang lullabies. The same mouth that had formed the word Papa in those precious few months before Samuel's cowardice stole everything away. Thomas. His son's name was Thomas, not Tom. The name Mary had chosen, after Samuel's own father. "God forgive me," Samuel whispered, though the words felt hollow in the morning air. Tom's condition had worsened through the night. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and the fever had settled into his bones like winter cold. Samuel had changed the bandages twice, each time watching more of his son's life seep into the cloth. The bullets had done their work well, torn through muscle and lung, leaving wounds that only a miracle could heal. Samuel had spent 12 years praying for miracles. This morning, he wondered if God was listening. Tom stirred, his eyes opening to find the pale light filtering through the window. For a moment, they were clear and present, no longer clouded by fever dreams. "Morning already?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Yes." Samuel reached for the water cup. "How do you feel?" Tom tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "Like I got shot 3 times. He accepted the water gratefully, managing to swallow most of it. "You stayed all night. Where else would I go? Most folks wouldn't risk it." Harboring a wanted man. Tom's gray eyes studied Samuel's face. "Why?" "Because you're my son. Because I failed you before you were old enough to walk. Because every sermon I've preached about mercy was meant for this moment, and I didn't even know it. Because it's the right thing to do, Samuel said instead. Tom nodded slowly. Mary used to say that. Do right by folks, Thomas, and the world will do right by you. His laugh was bitter. Guess she was wrong about that part. Thomas. Hearing the name from Tom's own lips was like taking a bullet to the chest. Samuel felt his composure cracking, 23 years of careful control beginning to crumble. Tell me about her, Samuel said. About Mary. What was she like? Tom's eyes softened. Strong. Strongest person I ever knew. Worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. Took in washing, cleaned the church, helped Doc Patterson with his birthing calls. He paused, lost in memory. Never complained. Not once. Even when the church ladies whispered about her, about me. The bastard son. Samuel flinched. They said that. Every Sunday. Loud enough for us to hear. Tom's hand moved to his chest, touching the bandages. Mary would just hold her head higher. Tell me they were scared people, trying to make themselves feel bigger by making us feel small. His voice grew quieter. She was beautiful when she was angry. Like fire. Samuel remembered that fire. The way Mary's green eyes would flash when someone treated her unfairly. The proud set of her shoulders when she faced down gossips and sanctimonious church wives. She'd been 19 when he met her, full of laughter and dreams. By the time he left, those dreams had all been centered on the child growing inside her. The child lying broken before him now. The father, Samuel said carefully. Samuel Cross. She never told you anything else about. Tom's expression darkened. What's to know? He was a drifter. Sweet-talked his way in her heart and her bed, then rode off when things got complicated. The bitterness in his voice cut like glass. Left her to face the shame alone. Left me to grow up answering questions about a man who never cared enough to stay. Each word was a lash across Samuel's soul. He thought of that last morning with Mary, the way she'd reached for him as he gathered his few possessions. Don't go, Samuel, she'd whispered. We can make this work. The 3 of us. But he'd been 22 and terrified, drowning in a responsibility he'd never wanted and a love that felt too big for his chest. I have to, he'd told her. God is calling me. But God hadn't called him. Fear had. Fear of being a father, of failing, of watching Mary's love turn to disappointment when she realized what kind of man she'd chosen. So he'd run to the desert and wrapped himself in holy cloth, convinced that serving God was nobler than serving his family. Now he saw the truth. He'd served no one but his own cowardice. Maybe, Samuel's voice cracked. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought leaving was better than staying and failing you both. Tom's eyes flashed with the same fire Samuel remembered in Mary. Then he was a fool. You don't abandon the people you love just because you're scared. You fight for them. You stay and figure it out. His breathing was getting labored again. Mary deserved better. I deserved better. Yes, Samuel whispered. You did. The admission hung between them like smoke. Tom studied Samuel's face with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he couldn't. He owed his son at least this much, the truth of his regret, even if he couldn't give him the truth of his identity. You got children, preacher? The question hit like a physical blow. Samuel's hands trembled as he reached for the water cup. No, he said. No, I never married. Never found the right woman. Samuel met his son's eyes. I found her. I wasn't brave enough to keep her. Something shifted in Tom's expression. A flicker of recognition, maybe, or just the fevered imagination of a dying man. What happened to her? I don't know. The lie tasted like ash. I left town before I could find out what became of her. Tom was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. What was her name? Samuel's throat closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The chapel walls seemed to press in around him, and the weight of 23 years settled on his chest like stones. Mary, he finally whispered. Tom's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, father and son stared at each other across the gulf of years and silence. Then Tom's face contorted with pain, not physical this time, but something deeper. No, Tom said, shaking his head weakly. No, that's not possible. But Samuel could see the recognition dawning in his son's eyes. The same gray eyes that looked back at him from the mirror each morning. The same stubborn jaw, the same long fingers, the same way of tilting his head when thinking through a problem. "Thomas," Samuel said, and the name fell between them like a stone into still water. Tom's breathing quickened. His hand found the edge of the pew, gripping it with white knuckles. You're him. You're Samuel Cross." Samuel nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm your father." The words hung in the air like a prayer and a condemnation. Tom stared at him with eyes that held 23 years of abandonment, of questions, of a love turned bitter by absence. His mouth opened, but no words came. "I'm sorry," Samuel said, the words pouring out like blood from a wound. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I was young and scared and stupid, and I thought leaving would be better for everyone. I thought Mary would find someone better, someone who could give you both the life you deserved." "You thought wrong," Tom said, his voice hollow. I know that now." Samuel reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering over his son's. "I've regretted it every day for 23 years. Every sunrise, every prayer, every moment of peace I thought I'd found. It was all built on the lie that I'd done the right." Tom closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "She waited for you, even when everyone told her to move on, to find a good man who'd give me his name. She waited. Said you'd come back when God was done with you. She was wrong. God was never done with me. I was just too much of a coward to come home. 23 years, Tom whispered. 23 years, I wondered what kind of man could walk away from his family. What kind of father could abandon his child? His voice broke. Now I know. The words hit Samuel like bullets. He deserved them, deserved worse. But hearing his failures spoken aloud by the son he'd failed was almost unbearable. "Thomas, please don't." Tom's voice was stronger now, fueled by pain and rage, and 23 years of questions finally answered. "Don't you dare ask for forgiveness. Not now. Not when I'm—" He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "Not when I'm dying because of what you made me." Samuel recoiled, as if slapped. "What I made you? You think I became an outlaw by choice? You think I chose this life?" Tom's eyes blazed. "I became what I had to become to survive in a world where having no father meant having no... where being a bastard meant being less than human." His breathing was getting worse. "Every job I robbed, every man I shot, every choice that led me here, it all started with you walking away." The truth of it crashed over Samuel like a wave. His son was right. The boy he'd abandoned had become a man shaped by that abandonment, hardened by a world that showed no mercy to the fatherless. The outlaw bleeding on his chapel floor was his creation, forged in the absence he'd left behind. "I know," Samuel said, his voice broken. "I know it's my fault. All of it." Tom stared at him for a long moment, and Samuel saw something shift in his son's eyes. The rage was still there, but underneath it, something else. Something that looked like the child he'd been, reaching for a father who was already walking away. "Why now?" Tom asked quietly. "Why tell me now when I'm dying? When it's too late to matter?" Samuel had no answer. No words that could bridge 23 years of silence or heal wounds that had festered in the dark. He could only kneel beside the pew where his son lay dying and offer the one thing he had, the truth. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the chapel in shades of gold and shadow, father and son faced each other across a chasm that 23 years had carved, and wondered if love, however broken, could build a bridge strong enough to carry them both home. A dying outlaw whispered, "Forgive me," to the father who'd abandoned him. And in that moment, both men discovered that grace isn't about deserving salvation. It's about love surviving the unforgivable. The sun reached its peak as Thomas's breathing grew shallow and uneven. Samuel had not moved from his knees beside the pew, had not eaten, had barely spoken since the terrible revelation hours before. His son, and he could finally claim that word, even if only in the silence of his own heart, drifted in and out of consciousness, each return to wakefulness briefer than the last. The anger had burned out of Thomas like fever breaking. Now, there was only exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had carried too much for too long. His gray eyes, when they opened, held a strange peace that made Samuel's chest ache. "I'm dying," Thomas said during one of his clearer moments, the words matter of fact rather than afraid. "Yes," Samuel said quietly. There was no point in lies now. "Good." Thomas's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm tired of running. Tired of being what I became." Samuel reached out, his fingers hovering over his son's hand. "May I?" Thomas looked at the offered touch for a long moment, then nodded. Samuel's fingers closed around his son's, the first time he'd held those hands since Thomas was small enough to fit in his arms. They were calloused now, scarred from violence and hard living. But underneath, Samuel felt the echo of the child who'd once reached for him with perfect trust. "Tell me about the good times," Thomas whispered. "With Mary. Before I ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything, son." The word came out naturally, without thought, and Samuel saw Thomas's eyes widen slightly. "I did that all by myself." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Tell me anyway." Samuel closed his eyes, letting 23 years of buried memories surface. "She laughed all the time when we first met. Had this way of throwing her head back when something struck her funny. You could hear her 3 buildings away." He smiled despite the tears on his cheeks. "First time I saw her, she was chasing Mrs. Henderson's pig down Main Street, her skirts hiked up and her hair flying loose. Most improper thing you ever saw." "Sounds like Mary," Thomas said softly. "She was working at the boarding house then, cleaning rooms and helping with meals. I was just passing through, planning to catch the next stage west." Samuel's thumb moved across his son's knuckles. "But she served me supper that first night, and when she smiled, I forgot all about leaving." "What changed your mind?" "About staying, I mean." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. The truth was complicated, bound up with dreams and fears he'd never been able to untangle. "She made me want to be better than I was. Made me think maybe I could build something worth having." His voice broke. "But when she told me about you, about the baby, I got scared. Started thinking about my own father. What about him? He was a good man. Better than I deserved. Worked himself to death trying to provide for us, and I was afraid I'd do the same. Afraid I'd fail you both." Samuel met his son's eyes. "So I convinced myself that leaving was noble, that God was calling me to serve something higher than family." Thomas studied his father's face. "But he wasn't, was he? Calling you, I mean." "No." The admission came out like a prayer. "I was just a coward who dressed his fear up in holy words." They sat in silence as the afternoon light slanted through the chapel window. Thomas's breathing was getting more labored, and Samuel could see the gray pallor of approaching death settling into his features. But his eyes remained clear, fixed on his father's face with an intensity that made Samuel want to look away. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said suddenly. "What?" "About Mary. About what she really thought of you." Samuel braced himself for another blow, another truth that would cut him to the bone. "She loved you," Thomas said simply. "Even at the end, even dying, she loved you. But she was angry too. Angry and hurt and disappointed." He paused, struggling for breath. "But mostly she was sad. Sad that you never came home. Sad that you never got to see what kind of man your son became. She wouldn't have been proud of what I became," Thomas continued, his voice growing weaker. "Outlaw, killer, thief, everything she tried to keep me from being. She would have been proud of your love for her," Samuel said fiercely. "Proud that you risked everything to buy her a headstone. Proud that, even dying, you're thinking of her instead of yourself." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "You think so? I know so. I killed men, Samuel. Good men, probably. Men with families." The name fell naturally from his lips now, without the anger that had colored it hours before. How does a father forgive his son for that? Samuel thought of his 12 years in the desert, preaching about mercy and redemption while carrying his own unforgiven sins like stones in his chest. The same way a son forgives his father for abandoning him, I suppose. By choosing love over justice. Is that what you're doing? Choosing love. Samuel looked at his son, really looked at him. Saw past the outlaw reputation and the blood-stained clothes to the boy who'd grown up fatherless, who'd made choices born of pain and abandonment, who'd become exactly what a world without mercy had shaped him to be. Yes, Samuel said. I'm choosing love. Thomas nodded slowly. Mary would have liked that. She always said love was stronger than law, stronger than death. His grip on Samuel's hand tightened. Do you think there's anything after? After this? Samuel thought of all his sermons about heaven and hell, about judgment and eternal reward. But looking into his son's eyes, those theological certainties crumbled into dust. I don't know, he said honestly, but if Mary's waiting somewhere beyond all this pain, then you'll see her again. And maybe, he swallowed hard, maybe she'll help you forgive an old fool who took 23 years to find his way home. Already forgiven, Thomas whispered. The words hit Samuel like a physical force. Thomas, no, listen. Thomas's voice was fading, but his eyes burned bright. I forgive you. For leaving for the life I live, for everything. You came back. Maybe not the way either of us planned, but you came back. His breathing hitched. That has to count for something. Samuel broke then, 23 years of guilt and regret pouring out in sobs that shook his entire frame. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands, feeling his son's pulse flutter weak but steady beneath his fingers. I love you, he whispered. I've loved you every day since I walked away. I just didn't know how to come back. I know, Thomas said softly. I know, Papa. The word, the name he'd never earned but always longed to hear, shattered what was left of Samuel's composure. He wept for the child he'd abandoned, for the woman who'd died loving a ghost, for the 23 years they'd all lost to fear and pride and stubborn silence. When he looked up, Thomas was watching him with something that might have been peace. Will you pray for me? Thomas asked. When I'm gone. Will you ask God to forgive what I've done? Every day, Samuel promised. For the rest of my life. Thomas smiled then, the first real smile Samuel had seen cross his son's face. It transformed him, made him look younger, and for a moment Samuel could see the boy he'd been. The boy who might have grown up loved and guided instead of abandoned and hardened. Tell me about the songs, Thomas said suddenly. The ones Mary used to sing. Do you remember any of them? Samuel's throat closed, but he nodded. In a voice rough with tears, he began to sing one of the Irish lullabies Mary had loved. A song about sailors coming home from the sea, about love that waited through long nights and longer years. Thomas closed his eyes and smiled as the words washed over him. His breathing grew more peaceful, and some of the tension left his face. Samuel sang until his voice gave out, then hummed the melody while his son slipped deeper into whatever dreams awaited him. The sun was setting when Thomas opened his eyes for the last time. The chapel was painted in shades of gold and amber, and dust motes danced in the slanted light, like tiny prayers made visible. Samuel, Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. I'm here, son. Thank you. For staying with me. For not letting me die alone. Thank you, Samuel said, for forgiving a foolish old man. Thomas squeezed his father's hand with what little strength he had left. Take care of Mary's grave, will you? When this is over, make sure she gets that headstone. I will. I promise. Thomas nodded and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, each breath a longer pause than the last. Samuel held his son's hand and watched the light fade from the sky, knowing that something precious and irreplaceable was slipping away with it. When the end came, it was quiet. Thomas drew one last, shallow breath, then simply stopped. His hand went slack in Samuel's grip, and the terrible weight of his breathing, a sound that had filled the chapel for 2 days, fell into silence. Samuel sat in the growing darkness, holding his son's still hand, and wept for everything they'd lost and everything they'd found in these final hours. Outside, the desert wind began to sing through the sage, and somewhere in that vast emptiness, Samuel thought he heard the echo of Mary's voice, welcoming their boy home at last. 3 days later, Samuel buried his son in the chapel's small cemetery, under a wooden cross he'd carved with shaking hands. The inscription was simple: Thomas Cross, beloved son. He'd given the boy his real name at last, the name that should have been his from birth. The $300 from the redemption bank robbery, Samuel had found it in Thomas's saddlebags. He sent anonymously to the bank with a letter explaining it belonged to a man who died seeking redemption. The rest he spent on 2 headstones, one for his son, and one that he carried 20 miles south to the pauper's cemetery where Mary lay forgotten. He knelt in the dust beside her unmarked grave and carved her name into the stone with his own hands, weeping for the woman who'd loved him enough to wait, who'd died, calling his name into the darkness. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels and spoke to the empty air, telling Mary about their son's last days, about his forgiveness, about the peace that had settled over his features. He told her he was sorry for leaving, for the life she'd lived alone, for the son who'd grown up fatherless and fierce. And in the desert wind that stirred the dust around her grave, Samuel could swear he heard her voice one last time, soft as a prayer and twice as forgiving. Welcome home, Samuel Cross. Welcome home. He returned to his chapel a different man than he'd left it. The sermons he preached now carried the weight of lived experience, of sins faced and grace received. He spoke of fathers and sons, of love that survived abandonment, of redemption that came not through deserving but through the simple act of staying when everything in you wanted to run. And every evening, as the sun set over the desert, Samuel Cross knelt before 2 graves and sang Irish lullabies into the wind, keeping faith with a love that had proven stronger than death, deeper than failure, and more persistent than 23 years of silence. In the end, he learned grace wasn't something you earned. It was something you received, from a dying son who called you Papa, from a dead woman who waited in the wind, from a God who specialized in making fathers out of men who'd forgotten how to stay. The lonely preacher had saved a dying outlaw, only to discover he was his son from years ago. But in the end, it was the son who'd saved the father, not from bullets or blood, but from a lifetime of running from the love that had been waiting for him to come home.